Hello, and welcome to this video where we will continue our journey in the risk management and security domain of CISSP, which is domain number one. And we will follow up on what we have seen in the last video about the quantitative and the qualitative risk management. Now, based on what is the outcome of that qualitative or quantitative risk management procedures, we have to select what we called as risk responses. Now, what are the various kind of risk responses? We have, for example, to begin with, accept the risk. It may so happen that the risk that is applicable to the business or to the processes is such that mitigating or reducing them costing more than what actually the risk of that particular type entails or have a negative impact on the business. Therefore, it is important that in cases like this, it is better to accept the risk and continue with the business operations. Importantly, not all risks are acceptable. Therefore, you also have to take the initiative and the step of mitigating the risk, which means reducing the impact or the likelihood of that risk happening. For example, you can take the case of a laptop encryption or a wipe, where we try to mitigate the risk of, in case a laptop is stolen or lost, we will be able to protect the data by simply wiping it off. Now, it may so happen that the wipe procedure is not oh, fully adhered to or is not fully compatible in terms of deleting all the data, which means there may be possibility of some leftover data, which can also be translated into what we call as a leftover risk or the residual risk. Another aspect or another response could be that we transfer the risk. For example, in case of using insurances. So if I, for example, managing a data center and there is a probability of my data center getting flooded, it could be that I may not be able to prevent the flood from occurring, but I may be able to take an insurance and transfer the risk of the flood being happening and damaging the data center to a third party or to a third party insurer. Of course, the insurance doesn't come free of cost, and it entails the cost that you may have to consider along with the insurer, that what would happen if the insurance has to be invoked. It could also be that we have risk avoidance strategies where, for example, we try to perceive the risk beforehand and then choose already some of the measures or the controls that we may want to implement. Example, a very naive example could be that if none of the employees gets the laptop, then there will be no possibility of the data loss. However, then you have to weigh this in terms of whether the business will continue if your employees doesn't have a laptop, and that is where the balancing act between risk, control, and what is the business objective and how to achieve the business objective is important. Now, it could be a case that at times that the risk is so overwhelming or so annoying, so costly that you may simply wanna reject it. Now, rejecting a risk is never a good response because it may manifest itself in one way or the other and harm your business. Therefore, this is never an acceptable solution. It could be that it may also create liability towards your business to the wider stakeholders or the public or the audiences which may be using your or which may be using or depending on your business. It is also a very realistic possibility that while you try to solve a risk, you may end up creating another risk or a secondary risk. For example, you create the dividers on the highways to keep the traffic separated, the oncoming and outgoing traffic, but it could also act as an obstacle or a cause for an accident where the car, when rams into such a divider, may end up killing the driver. So you prevent at a very high, at a very broader level, traffic from incoming and outgoing traffic to collide, but it may also end up that somebody colliding with the divider and may ending up losing his or her life. So that risk is always there. So preventing one risk may end up creating a secondary risk. Now, a thing to consider that all these risk responses have to be holistically balanced in terms of what is the security effectiveness of the response, what is the cost effectiveness of the response, and what is the operational impact. For example, applying a response, if it ends up in closing your business for 1 month, you may have to reconsider the approach. All these responses are subject to, in most of the cases, at the discretion of the senior management, that what is that they want to choose out of the various options that they have. And it could be that while doing so, the due consideration between security effectiveness, cost, and operational effectiveness is thoroughly kept into balance. It is also important to note that for the secondary risk, or to avoid having secondary risk, compensating controls may play a very major role. So do keep the value of compensating controls in your consideration, that they do not exist for nothing. They do exist for a very fair reason. How do you present these risk responses? It has to be a structured place where the data is collected, with which the senior management then able to choose a response based on various considerations that we have seen previously. So it is normally done in most of the cases in what we call as a risk register. It is where you categorize the risk among various risks, so that the similar risk or risk of flooding or earthquake and natural disaster comes into one category versus risk of electricity failure, which may comes in a different category. You break down the identification numbers for easy retrieval of the risk. A description will definitely help, so that you will be able to uh, think about it, where does the risk actually occurring, the impact and the consequences, the probability and the likelihood. A risk score based on either qualitative or a quantitative means, and you can follow, for example, certain risk mitigation steps, like we follow in the incident management process, is by way of identifying, analyzing, planning a response, monitoring, and control, like plan, do, check, act kind of thing. So the risk register here is very helpful for you to structure the data in such a way out of which a proper risk response then can be chosen by the senior management. I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.